Let's take a look at 5 different types of childhood trauma. I'm going to explore acute, chronic, complex, developmental, and generational trauma. Let's start off with acute, chronic, and complex trauma. These 3 different types of trauma refer to trauma that results from traumatic experiences that happen at different frequencies and intensities. Acute trauma is trauma that results from a single incident, so a one-off event. This could be something like a car accident, a sudden bereavement, a natural disaster, or a significant incident like a fall or a near drowning in water. You can identify acute trauma because it comes from a one-off event that results in a trauma response. An important thing to remember about acute trauma is that the child doesn't actually have to be subject to the event itself. They could just witness the event and they could still have a traumatic response from what they witnessed. Let's look at chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is exposure to repeated or prolonged traumatic events. With chronic trauma, the traumatic event is usually the same event, but it happens time and time again over a prolonged period. Types of traumatic events that can fall within this category include things like domestic violence or physical abuse if they happen time and time again. Another type of chronic trauma that would fall within this category, which is often overlooked, would be something like bullying. If that bullying happened time and time again and caused the child distress, or if they were fearful. The bullying could have a long-term impact on their emotional well-being or psychological functioning. That impact would be a trauma impact from the repeated and prolonged bullying. You can identify chronic trauma because it comes from one type of traumatic event that happens time and time again. The resulting trauma impact is often also prolonged because of the type of events experienced. The third type of trauma we're going to talk about that results from exposure to traumatic experiences that happen at a different frequency is complex trauma. Complex trauma is exposure to multiple types of traumatic events that can occur over prolonged periods. So what does this look like? Well, often complex trauma can be associated with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. A young person can be exposed to multiple ACEs or multiple traumatic events, which can then result in complex trauma. This can be things like experiencing neglect, domestic violence, and adult substance misuse all at the same time. Exposure to multiple traumatic events that can have multiple traumatic impacts is complex, hence the term complex trauma. Complex trauma is an in-depth topic, and we really need to be able to understand the type of trauma the child has experienced and the actual trauma impact on them to be able to support them. Complex trauma also often goes hand in hand with our 4th type of trauma, which is developmental trauma. Developmental trauma is where traumatic experiences have impacted on a child or young person's development. This can often happen with complex trauma, where a child is exposed to varied and multiple traumatic events and they impact on their development. One of the things to remember about developmental trauma is that any area of development can be impacted. A young person's growth, motor abilities, sensory abilities, emotional skills, social skills, or relational skills can all be delayed through developmental trauma. And those are just a few of the areas that developmental trauma can impact. With developmental trauma, it's the traumatic events that have impacted on the young person's development. The 5th type of trauma we're going to explore is generational trauma. Generational trauma is the same type of trauma that continues across generations. So the trauma continues from grandparent to parent to child. Generational trauma often happens because the trauma that originally happened with a grandparent hasn't been resolved, so it continues to happen through generations. An example of this could start with a grandparent who isn't provided with emotional warmth within their own childhood. If that trauma is never repaired, they might not know that they need to give their own child emotional warmth, and their child might lack emotional warmth in their own childhood. If their trauma is then not repaired, they may then also go on to not give their own child emotional warmth. And you can see this across generation and generation and generation. You can identify generational trauma because it's the same type of trauma that keeps occurring across generations.
That's acute, chronic, complex, developmental and generational trauma.
Here's one final trauma-informed care top tip. Caring for or supporting a child who's experienced trauma can be really difficult. Quite often, they present with really complex emotions and behaviours. Understanding the trauma history and the trauma they've experienced can really help us to empathise and really understand where they're coming from. Learn as much as you can about their trauma history because it can really help us to regulate ourselves and remain calm when really difficult things are happening for our children. Subscribe to us at Tribe Trauma Informed Care for more trauma informed care in practice.